The Hawthorne Effect, coined in 1958 by Henry A. Landsberger, refers to the modification of human behavior in response to the awareness of being observed. This concept comes from studies conducted between 1924 and 1932 at the Hawthorne Western Electric Plant in Cicero, Illinois. Scholars scrutinized the results of these experiments, suggesting the findings may be embellished. In the earliest study, performed from 1924 to 1927, work conditions for electrical relay producers were manipulated mainly through varying lighting conditions. Contrarily to the initial hypothesis, productivity did not consistently rise with lighting increases. It appeared that any change impacted the workers' output, a conclusion which later proved incorrect. Later studies, associated with Elton Mayo between 1928 and 1932, focused on shifting work structure such as altering rest periods among a group of 5 women. The limited control and poor methodology of these studies, however, made drawing definitive conclusions impossible. Landsberger later analyzed the studies, proposing that the subjects' productivity temporarily increased because of the novelty and attention of being part of the research. This theory became known as the Hawthorne Effect. One of the most compelling experiments involved manipulating the work environment in various ways, from increasing illumination to repositioning workstations. Each change resulted in short-term productivity spikes, further reinforcing the Hawthorne Effect. Over 5 years, 1927-1932. In one particular experimental setup, assembly line women worked in a segregated area. Their output was mechanically measured by counting the completed relays they dropped down a chute. A tracking process initiated secretively 2 weeks before the experiment started and sustained throughout the experiment. Various work conditions were altered under the watchful eye of a supervisor, who would then discuss the impact on productivity. For instance, after conferring with the women, 2 5-minute breaks were integrated into their schedule, then increased to 2 10-minute breaks. Although there was an initial productivity improvement when 6 5-minute breaks were imposed against their preference, productivity lowered. This and similar experiments contributed to the development of the Hawthorne Effect, demonstrating how the simplest changes can temporarily influence productivity when workers are aware of observation. The study deduced that an increase in productivity could be attributed to the liberty of choosing one's colleagues, the power of collective working, a sense of superiority through separate working spaces, and the presence of an empathetic supervisor. According to Elton Mayo's interpretation, the enhanced effectiveness was due to the 6 individuals formulating a dedicated and cooperative team. Another study was also performed, but its results weren't as prominent as the former. The ensuing investigation aimed to analyze the impact of monetary incentives on productivity. Unexpectedly, productivity declined. This was presumed to be due to workers fearing job losses if their proficiency peaked. The experiment, conducted by Elton Mayo and W. Lloyd Warner from 1931 to 1932, involved 14 men tasked with telephone switchgear assembly. Despite individual productivity payments, productivity dropped due to the looming fear of a reduced base rate. Keen observations revealed the development of cliques or informal groupings within the formal groups that shaped informal behavioral rules and mechanisms to enforce them. These cliques would answer uniformly when quizzed by superiors, even when deceit was involved. This behavior demonstrates that the workers were more inclined to follow their fellows rather than the manager's rules and incentives. Several different perspectives have been offered to explain the Hawthorne Effect, portrayed by Richard Nisbet as a glorified anecdote. In fact, he suggests that once one identifies the anecdote, the data becomes insignificant. J.E.G. Adair warned about the gross inaccuracies in the secondary publications on the Hawthorne Effect, stating that it should actually be considered as Orrin's experimental demand effect variant. According to Adair, this effect depends on the participant's perception of the situation, implying the necessity for manipulation checks in social science experimentations. He proposes that subjects' perception, rather than their awareness of being observed, affects the result of the experiment. One must therefore question how the participant's perception of the situation interacts with their goals. Potential explanations for the Hawthorne Effect could be the receipt of performance feedback or increased motivation to please the experiment conductor, provided it doesn't interfere with other drives. The presence of hidden agenda of the experimenter can also lead to skepticism. Hence, the Hawthorne Effect might only occur under specific circumstances, such as the provision of usable feedback or a shift in motivation. The experimental interventions caused workers to believe that conditions within the small work groups significantly differed from the usual shop floor. These studies, which were recreated with similar results on mica, splitting workers, were highly influential. Clark and Sugru's review of educational research stated that uncontrolled novelty effects, on average, led to a 30s rise in standard deviations, SD translating to a 50-63 score increase, which then decayed to a minimal effect after 8 weeks. According to Harry Braverman, the Hawthorne studies were based on industrial psychology, focusing on whether worker performance could be predicted by pre-hire testing. However, Braverman contended that they actually revealed the workplace not as a Weberian model of bureaucratic formal organization nor as a system of informal group relations, but rather one of power and class struggle. Economists Stephen Leavitt and John List, after a long, unsuccessful search for base data from the initial experiments, discovered in 2011 that such data did exist on a microfilm found at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. On reanalysis, they provided some support for the Hawthorne effect in the long term, but not as dramatically as initially suggested. Gustav Wickstrom and Tom Bendix argued against the Hawthorne effect. They suggested that research would benefit from including specific psychological and social variables to evaluate intervention effectiveness. Ongoing debates about the Hawthorne effect persist, but many often consider the phenomenon when designing and drawing conclusions from studies. Some have even developed methods to avoid it, such as remote field study observations or the use of unobtrusive measures. An interview with some participants revealed that they were paid significantly better, according to Greenwood, Bolton, and Greenwood's research. Despite initial skepticism about the impact of the observer effect in the famed Hawthorne experiments, the notion has gained considerable credibility among researchers. These scholars suggest that a secondary observer effect could be at play, particularly when dealing with secondary data such as survey or socioeconomic data, rather than influencing the subjects directly, as in the primary observer effect. Researchers unknowingly have their personal biases that affect how they interpret and handle the data, as well as the type of data drawn from secondary sources. For instance, certain steps a researcher takes in their statistical analysis, seemingly harmless at first, may generate significantly varied results using similar data, such as opting different weighting methods, factor analytic techniques, or estimation choices. Particularly, researchers might utilize software packages which inadvertently lead to minute yet significant fluctuations due to their unique default settings and adjustments over time. Furthermore, a researcher's source data may not appear identical, even if it might seem so initially. Taking the OECD socioeconomic data as an example, the Australian GDP data from 2000 could vary slightly between a researcher accessing it immediately and another researcher accessing it few years later. This concept of secondary observer effect was introduced by Nate Bresna in a relatively less known paper. Although not much emphasis has been placed on this phenomenon yet, the larger scientific implications it carries cannot be undermined. Existing evidences suggest that this effect could be spotted in studies where a common problem is handed over to multiple researchers or teams, each working independently with the same data for a solution. This method, known as crowdsourcing data analysis, was practiced in a landmark study by a conglomerate of researchers, Silberzahn, Raphael, Eric Uholman, Dan Martin, and Brian Nosek et al. 2015, on the issue of racial disparity in red card decisions in football.